Hello, and welcome to Glastonbury Romance, one of many, many, many already, and many going forward. When last we met, John Crow was on his way to Stonehenge. Let's continue. Oh boy, I forget where I was. Hold on. Stonehenge, let's see. Do you remember Never in His Life in a Road More Bleak? Remember the bleak road? Oh yeah, he saw Newt. That's where we left. Scrambled up the bank, picked up his bag, and limping back to the road. For the next mile, his mood was a good deal happier. He was pleased by the way every milestone he passed recorded the distance to Stonehenge, just as if he were a habitation of living men instead of what it was. 2 miles to Stonehenge, said the particular one he now reached, just as the after sunset nebulously began to turn into twilight. He sat on the ground with his back against the milestone. His blistered foot hurt him abdominally. It looks as if I should have to sleep among those great stones, he thought. I shall be at the end of my tether when I get there. A drowsiness fell upon him now, in spite of the pain in his foot, and his head began to nod over his clasped hands and his tightly hugged knees. Three things: the image of the bed at Maidenhead, with one of its brass knobs missing, the image of the great stones as he had long ago seen them in pictures, and the image of the newt sinking down into the dew pond, dominated his mind. He struggled frantically with the obsessing desire to sleep. The wind seemed to have dropped a little. Perhaps if I see a warm shed, he thought, I'll leave Stonehenge till tomorrow. I'm trying to, read a little quieter and more boring. I think I was getting a little too excited last couple ones, so I'm trying to bring it down to a real nice drone. He dragged his body into motion again and limped on. A motor car passed him on top speed, sounding its horn savagely. While it went by, his one fear was lest it should stop and offer him a lift. Its vicious look, its ugly noise, its mechanical speed, its villainous stench, the hurried glimpse he got of the smart people in it, all combined to make it seem worse to have any contact with such a thing than to die upon the road. His foot hurt him most evilly. He knew it was not serious. He had not sprained his ankle or even twisted it. It was only a blister, but the blister throbbed and burned, pulsed and ached, as if his heel had been struck with a poisoned arrow. The gray sky had changed a little in character now. It was dimly interspersed with twinkling points of pale luminosity. Most of these points were so blurred and indistinct that it would have been hard to catch them again at a second glance in the same position in the vast ether. They were like nothing on earth, and to nothing on earth could they be compared. They were the stars, not of the night, but of the twilight. The sky around those points of light was neither gray nor black. It was a color for which there is no name among artists' pigments, but the man limping across Salisbury Plain gave the color a name. He named it pain. Where it reached the climax of appropriateness was the west towards which the road was leading him. Here there was one fragment of sky exactly where the sun had vanished, that to the neutrality of the rest added an obscure tinge, just the faintest dying tinge, of rusty brown. This low-flying wisp of rusty brown was like the throbbing pulse from the pressure of whose living center pain spread through the firmament. Walking toward the west country was like walking toward some mysterious celestial fount, wherein pain was transmuted into an unknown element. First one leg, then the other leg. He had reached the point now of being conscious of the actual physical automatism of walking. That form of peculiar self-consciousness, which as an infant had made the art of walking a triumph of self-assertion, now returned upon him to make it a necessity of self-preservation. John Crow felt that he was nearing the end of his power over the very simple achievement of putting one leg in front of the other. He struggled forward for about half a mile. Then he stood still. I must find a place to lie down in, he thought. I can't go on. The Maidenhead bed, with the one gilt knob missing, had retreated now beyond the horizon of opportunity. The image of cattle-scented straw floated before him. A dull beating thud was proceeding from some portion of his body and traveling away from it into the darkness. He felt like a run-down clock which could not be hindered from a meaningless striking. Whether this thundering came from his heel, his heart, or his head, he could not tell. It might, for all he knew, come from the rusty brown place in the western sky. I need a little bite of this stuff. I can't go on, he repeated aloud. And then, quite as naturally as he had been grown conscious, in that infinite fashion, of the triumph of walking, he grew conscious now of the necessity of praying. And John Crow prayed calmly, fervently, simply, to the spirit of his mother. I know some of our viewers don't like people talking with their mouths full, so I'll try to be nice to them. Okay. His mother had died when he was 6 years old, and his devotion to his personality had been, ever since that day, not in the least different from the extremes of superstitious idolatry. The childish weakness of his character was just the sort of thing that would endear an old son, as John was, to the protective maternal instinct. The woman had died in a convulsive spasm of tragic tenderness for the child she had to leave. Nor is it difficult to conceive now, even on this most material plane, some formidable magnetic vibration issuing from the grave in the Axon churchyard might linger upon the chemical substratum of the ether and prove of genuine supernatural value to the child of her womb, when in his weakness he was most in need of her. Thus it happened that when he had finished praying, John found he could move forward again, although with very slow steps. His pace, indeed, was the pace now of an extremely old man who used his stick as a crutch, and anyone listening to his approach might have taken him for a lame man or a blind man. The heavy tap of his stick upon the road was a sound that traveled further than his footsteps. At last he came in sight of the faint whiteness of another milestone. This auto carried the token 1 mile to Stonehenge. But this time the roadway opposite the milestone was not empty. Under the nebulousness of that rusty brown horizon tinge stood a small, dark motor car. It had a red spot at the back, but no headlights. It obstructed the road, but it did not impinge upon the scene with the crude violence of the car that had recently passed him by. As John Crow limped up to the figure that he had not distinguished from the hedge, advanced into the road to intercept him. Again, he's not using commas here when he should. As John Crow limped up to it, a figure that he had not distinguished from the hedge advanced into a road to intercept him. Comma every once in a while would help, you know. You must let me take you on a bit, said a tall, gaunt, ungainly man wearing a dark bowler hat. You are too lame to be walking like this. I want to stop presently, a mile from here, but only for a minute or two. I am going to Glastonbury. A shiver of excitement ran through the worn-out frame of John Crow. I was done in, dead beat at the end of my tether, gasped John when he found himself safely inside the little car. And then, as they moved on very slowly, what must this impulsive man do but confess to the stranger how he had just prayed in the middle of the road to the spirit of his mother, and how he too was bound for Glastonbury? There is another explanation, my good friend, said the motorist gravely. My mind was at that moment absorbed in thoughts of Glastonbury. Yours was also. What more natural than I should ask you to let me take you there? John now became aware that although a few faint stars were visible, the departing day was still dominant. It will not be dark for half an hour yet, he thought. I shall see Stonehenge before night. They were now reaching a little upward slope of the road. The wide plain stretched around them, cold and mute, and it was in this daylight It was as if the daylight had ceased to perish out in the sky, even while the surface of the earth grew dark. The identity of that great space of downland was drawn upon itself, neither listening nor seeking articulation, lost in an interior world so much vaster and so much more important than the encounters of man with man, whether evoked by prayer or by chance, that such meetings were like the meetings of ants and beetles upon a twilight terrace, that had thoughts and memories of its own altogether outside such infinitesimal lives. To John's surprise, the stranger put on his brake and stopped his car. "Can you see that thorn?" asked the man. John peered forward through the twilight. Yes, he did clearly see the object indicated. It looked to him like a dead tree. "Is it a dead tree?" he inquired. But the man went on, "From the foot of that thorn, there's a path across the grass leading straight to Stonehenge. You can see Stonehenge from the foot of that thorn." "Can anyone go there at this hour? Someone told me in France that it was guarded after sunset by soldiers." "Are you able to come with me, or would you like best to stay here till I come back?" said the man, totally disregarding this remark. "I must come. Of course I must come with you," insisted John Crow. They got out of the little car together. The stranger gave John his arm. And although John would have liked to lean on a great deal more heavily than he did, it was some support. He hobbled along as best he could, leaning the bulk of his real weight upon his own root-handled hazel stick, and staring forward at the dead thorn tree with dazed curiosity. Deep in his mind he was thinking to himself, "I'll always pray to her for everything from now on. I'll pray to her that Mary and I can live together in Norfolk." When they reached the thorn tree, John stopped and drew a deep breath. He pressed heavily now on his companion's wrist and stared across the dark strip of downland turf before him, staggered and thunderstruck. Stonehenge! He had never expected something like this. He had expected the imposing, but this was the overpowering. "This is England," he thought in his heart. "This is my England. This is still alive. This is no dead ruin like Glastonbury. I am glad I've come to this before I died." "Will you excuse me, sir," he said in a loud, rather rasping voice, the voice he had always assumed when, in the presence of French officials, he wished to assert himself. "Will you excuse me if I sit down for a minute? Do you feel queer? Are you ill? I want to look at it from where we are." They sat down on the ground beside the thorn tree, and even as he did so John observed that from out of two dark twigs upon a twisted branch a few leaves were budding. "It's not quite dead," he remarked. The stranger naturally thought he was speaking of the dark pile in front of them. "You mean its powers not left it?" He paused and then went on in a low voice. "About 4,000 years it's been there. But, after all, what's that to some of the antiquities that are here in the world? But you're right. It's not quite dead." "It's very English," said John. The man turned and gave him a strange, indignant glare. "Is it England that's to hide your great secret?" he cried excitedly. "Is it English to keep your secret to the very end?" "Oh, what's going on there?" "I expect you know much more about it, sir, than I do," said John humbly. "But I don't feel that those stones have anything hidden. They look to me just what they are, neither more nor less. They look simply like stones, enormous stones lifted up to be worshipped." His companion swung around and hugged his shins, resting his chin on the top of his knees and balancing himself to the extreme tips of his haunch bones. He gave his head an angry toss so that his black bowler fell to the ground and rolled a few inches before lying still. "Could you worship a stone?" I think so," stammered John, a little disconcerted by the man's intensity. He must be a nonconformist preacher, he thought. "Simply because it's a stone?" cried the other, and he hugged his ankles so tightly and tilted himself forward so far that John was reminded of a certain goblinish gargoyle that he knew very well on an out-of-the-way portion of Notre Dame. "Certainly, simply because it's a stone." "And do you call that English?" the stranger almost groaned. "I could worship that nearest one," John said, "the one that stands by itself over there." The man jumped to his feet and, picking up his bowler hat, clamped it upon his head. He was a tall man, and he looked preternaturally tall as he stood between John and the stone which John had said he could worship. His profile was like that of a caricature of a Roman emperor. "Do you know what that stone's called?" he cried. "Do you know what it's called?" In his excitement, he bent down and shook John by the shoulders. John thought to himself, "I wish my stick had a heavier handle. This man is evidently a mad dissenting minister." "Have all these stones got names?" said John eagerly, making 2 desperate attempts to rise to his feet. The man gave him his hand, and John stood up. He surreptitiously substituted the handle of his hazel stick for its ferrule end and grasped it tightly. "If he becomes dangerous," he thought, "I'll stop backwards and hit him on the head with all my force." He laughed to himself as he swung his stick in the darkness. The great stone circle had stirred up to him an excitement the likes of which he had never felt in all his life before. The pain of his blistered heel became nothing. He lurched forward, pushed the man aside, and stumbled towards the huge, solitary, unhewed monolith which had attracted his attention. The other strode by his side, murmuring indignantly, "It's more than that, it's more than that." When he reached the stone, John embraced its rough bulk with his arms, his stick still clutching by the wrong end in his fingers. 3 times he pressed his face against it, and in his heart he said, "Stone of England, guard Mary Crow and make her happy." The stranger continued his surly protest. "This stone," he said, "is called the Healy stone. It's this stone which stands exactly between the sunrise on a certain day and the altar stone inside the circle. Hele. You see what that is, can't you? It's Helios, the sun. You've been playing your little game, sir, with the sunstone." But John, in that fading twilight, with Stonehenge looming up in front of him, was not to be overawed. He felt, too, far drunken with the magnetism emanating from these prehistoric monoliths and trilithons. He felt no longer afraid of blaspheming against any god, even against the great sun himself. The 2 men confronted each other. It was not yet too dark for them to see each other's faces. John leaned on his stick in a normal manner now. The sight of the look of his companion's aquiline nose, combined with his last remark, had reassured him. No religious maniac would have referred to Helios. John continued their disputation. "I believe this stone," he said dogmatically, "is far older than the rest. I believe Stonehenge was built here because of this stone. I think stone worship is the oldest of all religions, and easier to sympathize with than any other religion." The stranger made no reply and looked around him with the air of one who listens intently. "Come," he said peremptorily, taking hold of John by the upper part of his arm. "Let's enter the circle." They moved on for a short distance and came upon a large stone lying flat at their feet. The man's fingers clutched John's flesh now with a convulsive clutch. Clutched with a clutch. "You know what that is, I suppose?" he said. John's answer to this was to tear himself loose, go down on his knees, fumble at the stone with his hands, scoops up some 7-day-old rainwater that he had come upon in a hollow concavity there, and lap it up noisily with his lips. The stranger's tall figure hovered over him like a great, agitated, dusky bird. He was wearing a long, old-fashioned overcoat, thin at the waist and very baggy around the legs, and the tail of his kept flapping against his ankles as he went circling around John's crouching figure, gasping forth bewildered protests. Well, I read a little bit overboard that time, but I wanted to get to page 100. Yes, we're 100 pages into Glastonbury Romance now. That means we only have about 1,100 to go. And there's going to be many, many, many more Glastonbury Romances to enjoy. So I hope I see you there for them. Until then, cheers.